Aleister Crowley's 81st Liber, the Butterfly Net. Moonchild, chapter 17, is of the report which Edwin Arthwait made to his chief, and of the deliberations of the Black Lodge thereupon, and of the conspiracies thereby concerted with a discourse upon sorcery. Exordiumatically, opponent, prakateth, atiti, orient, exaudient, dole. Basilicals, assumpt, pragmatics, ex ventro, genesiaco, ad umbilicum, apocalypticum, terminated, logo maco epis, nodal punks, genetically, Benedict, eschatologically, caco, glyphotopical, erg, moiratic, apert, partheno, or hododactylical, colophoned, thanatoskiancomorphic. Footnote translation. Exordiumatically first. Genetically at first. Deponent. Precateth, I beg. Benedict, fortunate. Atati, hearing. Eschatologically, later. Orient, increasing in a bad hole. Caco, glyphotopical in a bad hole. Exaudient, favorable. Erg, work. Dole, basilicals, a royal gift. Moiratic, fatal. Assumpt, assumption. Apert, opened. Pragmatics, facts, like the Parthen or hododactyl, like the ex ventro, genesiaco, ad umbilicum, rosy fingers of a maid. Apocalypticum, from beginning. Colophon, closed, to end. Tabanatoskiancomorphic, in the determinate mark. Determinate mark, the shape of the valley of the shadow. Logo maco epis, my stories of death. Nodal puncts, limits. With these striking words, the official report of Douglas, Chief Commissioner, began. It would be tedious to quote the 488 folio pages in full. Douglas himself did not read it. The transcript made by Vesquit of Abdul Bey's inspiration, with a few practical questions to the latter, told him all that he needed. Audience over, dismissed Arthwait and his companions with orders to hold themselves in readiness for a renewal of the campaign. Douglas had many a moment of bitter contemplation. His hatred of Cyril Gray fed upon repulse, and it was evident that his assistants had met more than their match. He would have to act personally, yet he feared to expose himself in open battle. His plan hitherto had been to bribe or dupe some of the jackal journalists of London to attack him, but Gray had not so much as troubled to bring libel actions. But he would not give in. He studied Vesquit's transcripts attentively and with indecision. He did not know how far to trust the oracle, and he did not understand how this quit had come to die, since on that point even Arthwait had been silent. The demons who he consulted were emphatic in favor of the document, but failed to explain how the fortress was to be reduced from the inside. He is perfectly clear in his mind as to the nature of Gray's operation. He saw perfectly that Lisa herself was the weak point in it, but he did not see how to get at her. He continued in his better mood until the early hours, and he was interrupted by the return of his wife from her miserable night's trudging. She put 2 francs on the table without a single word as soon as she entered. "Is that all?" snarled Douglas. "You ought to be getting 5s again now. Spring's coming, though you're not as pretty as you were." He garnished this greeting with a garlic of low abuse. Rarely to any other person did he even use mild oaths. He affected the grand manner, but he knew that Valmus's speech emphasized his wife's degradation. He had no need of the vile money that she earned. He had 1,000 better means of buying whiskey, but he drove her to the streets as no professional citoyen would have dared do. By extreme refinement of cruelty, he never struck or kicked her, lest she should think he loved her. To him, she was a toy, a means of exercising his passion for torture. To her, he was the man she loved. Pitifully, as she pleaded that the cold rain of the night she was wet through had driven all Paris from the boulevard to the cafe, she added an excuse for her unattractiveness which should have sent her husband to his pistol. Her very shame had a spark of manhood or a memory of his mother been alive within him. Instead, he promised to change all that the next time Dr. Bullock came to Paris. He had systematically degraded and humiliated her, corrupted her, branded her with infamy for many a year, yet there was still in her a motion of revolt against the crime. But even as she made her gesture of repulsion, Douglas leapt to his feet with the light of hell burning in his eyes. "I have it," he shouted. "Get to your straw, you stinking slut, and you may thank your stars that as you can't be ornamental, you're going to be useful." It was dawn before Douglas turned into bed, for his great idea brought with it a flood of imagination and a million problems of detail. The servant girl was already half dressed for the day's work, and he made her fetch him a final whiskey before he slept. Late in the following afternoon he woke and sent Kramers, whom he had turned into a drudge, to telegraph to Bullock to come over and to bring her friend Butcher to see him. Douglas had previously refused to see this man, who was a Chicago semi-tough. He ran a fake Rosicrucian society in America and thought that Douglas could give him power over the elusive dollar, but Douglas had found no use for him. He rather insisted on respectability in his neophytes. It was only in the higher grades that one found the disreputable. It was an obvious point of policy, but Douglas had now remembered one little fact about this person. He fitted the great idea so nicely that his presence in Paris seemed as apt as an answer to prayer. It was a rare, if doubtful, privilege to visit Douglas in his home. He never allowed the visit of any but those high in his confidence. The locality was hardly inspiring to an inquiring duchess. He had 2 other places in Paris, which he used for 2 types of interviewer. For although he discouraged knowledge of his authority in the Black Lodge, he did a good deal of fishing himself, especially with rich or highly placed people, for his subordinates had sticky fingers. One of these places was a discreet apartment in the very best quarter of Paris. Here he was the Scottish nobleman of the old school. The decorations were rich but not gaudy. Even the ancestors were not overdone. The place of honor was occupied by Rob Roy's claymore alleged. One of his claims was that the Highland Cateran was his ancestor, owing to a liaison with the fairy. Another claim was that he himself was James IV of Scotland, that he had survived the Battle of Flodden Field, become an adept and immortal, despite what, to a profaned mind, seemed the incompatibility of these 2 legends, to say nothing of the improbability of either. They were greedily swallowed by the theosophist section of his following. In this apartment, he received the credulous type of person who is impressed by rank, and no man could play the part of stateliness better than this old popate. His other place was at the hermit's cell model, a tiny cottage with its well-kept garden, such abound all over Paris in the most unexpected spots. He actually imposed upon the old lady who kept this house for him. Here he was the simple old man of utter holiness, the lonely recluse, the saintly anchorite. His only food, bruised herbs or pulse. His only drink the same as quenched the thirst of Father Adam. His long absences from the sacrosanct abode were explained by the fact of his absorption in trance in which he was supposed to indulge underground. Of course, he only visited the place when he had to receive a certain type of visitor, that loftier type which has enough rank and wealth to show that they are not necessary to search after truth, and is impressed by simplicity and saintliness. It was at the former address that the Count received Mr. Butcher. He was dressed in severe and refined broadcloth, with the rosette of the Legion of Honor, to which he was well entitled, in his buttonhole. In presence of this splendor, the American was ill at ease, but Douglas knew how to make a man his own by giving him a good conceit of himself. "I'm proud to meet you, Mr. Butcher," he began affably. "May I beg of you to take the trouble to be seated? The chair is worthy of you," he added with a smile. It was at one time the property of Frederick the Great. The servant, who was dressed as a Highland gillie in gala costume, offered cigars and whiskey. "Say, this is sure some whiskey, Count. This is where I fall off the wagon one time, John. You watch my batting average," observed Mr. Butcher, settling himself by placing his legs upon the table. "And it is from the private stock of the Duke of Argyll," returned Douglas. "And you, Mr. Butcher, I knew a Count Butcher many years ago. You are a relation." Mr. Butcher had only the vaguest notion as to his ancestry. His mother had broken down under cross-examination. "Search me," he replied, biting the end of his cigar and spitting it out. "We Rosicrucians are out for the 100 Years Club dope, and the long green stone we should worry. We're short on ancestors in Illinois, but these matters are important in magic," urged Douglas. "Heredity goes for much. I should be glad indeed to hear that you were one of the Dorsetshire butchers, for example, or even the Shropshire branch. In both families, second sight is an appanage." Here the conversation was interrupted by the gillie. "I crave your pardon, my lord," he said, bowing, "but his grace, the Duke of Hants, is at the door to beg your aid in a most urgent matter which concerns his family honor." "I am engaged," said Douglas. "He may write." The man withdrew a solemn bow. "I must apologize for this disturbance," continued Douglas. "The importunity of one's clients is exceedingly distressing. It is one of our penalties. I venture to suppose that you are yourself much annoyed in similar ways." Butcher would have liked to boast that J.P. Morgan was always trying to borrow money from him, but he dared not attempt to bluff his host, nor did he suspect that Douglas was himself engaged in that diverting and profitable pastime. "To come to business," went on Douglas, eyeing his guest narrowly, and assuring himself that his scheme had borne fruit in due season. "What is it that you require of me? Frankly, I like you, and I have long admired your noble career. All that I can do for you in honor, pray count it done." "Why, Count," said Mr. Butcher, spitting on the floor, "Vadinsky's in Kalamazoo. But to come down to brass tacks, I guess I'd like to sit into the game." "I pray you to excuse me," replied Douglas, "but my long residence in Paris has almost deprived me of the comprehension of my mother tongue. Could you explain yourself further?" "Why, this Black Lodge stunt, Count, is a humdinger. I guess it's a hell of a favor. But I see $1 at the end of it. An old Dr. Butcher buys a one-way ticket." Douglas grew portentous. "Are you aware of what you ask?" he thundered. "Do you understand that the ineffable and sacrosanct arcanum is not to be touched by profane hands? Must I inform you that those who may not be named are even now at the gate of the abyss, whetting their fangs upon the cubical stone of the unutterable? O ye magistral ministrants of the shrine of the unspeakable abomination, hear ye the word of blasphemy. He spoke rapidly and thickly in a tongue unknowable to Butcher, who became alarmed and even took his legs off the table. Say, he cried, have a heart. Can the rough dope count? This is the straight proposition. Honest God, I'm already aware of your sincerity, answered the other, but infinite courage is required to confront those formidable entities that lie in wait of the seeker, even at the first portal of the descending staircase. Now, of course, in Kabbalah, you form the cube of space. Well, I mean, with the 7 letters, you form sort of a sphere, I guess. But the cube is the 12 letters of the zodiac. Well, the cube is also the mental construction of consciousness and so on and so forth. Oh, I'm wise to old dog Cerberus, Ish, Kabebel. Give me an upper berth in the Chicago, St. Louis, and Hell Limited. If it busts the roll, do you get me, Steve? I understand you to say that you persist in your application. Sure, Andrew P. Satan for mine. I shall be pleased to place your name before the watchers of the gate. How deep do I have to dig? Dig? I did not quite catch your remark. In the wad, weigh the dough. What does it set me back? Me for the breadline. The initiation fee is 1,000 francs. I guess I can skim that off without having to eat at Child's. You will remit the amount to the comptroller of my private purse. Here is the address. Now be so good to sign the preliminary application form. They went over to the bureau. Douglas was prepared to derive it from the library of Louis XIV, on which lay a private letter from the Kaiser, if one might believe the embossed arms and address, with a note asking President Poincaré to dinner. Quite informally, my dear friend, which Butcher could not fail to see, the preliminary application form was a document which might have served for an exceptionally solemn treaty. But Douglas was above the charlatanism of requiring a signature in blood. Butcher signed it with an ordinary fountain pen. And now, Mr. Butcher, said Douglas, I will ask in your turn, to render me a small service. Bat it up, said Mr. Butcher. I would buy an illustrated edition of O. Henry in 19 parts. Douglas did not know that Americans dread book agents more than rattlesnakes, but he gathered that his guest would acquiesce in any reasonable suggestion. I am informed that you are or were a priest of the Roman Church. Peter is my middle name, admitted the Rosicrucian, and that's no jolly. But apart from questions of nomenclature for the moment, if you will pardon me, you are a priest of the Roman Church? Yep, I took a chance on Pope Dago Benedict, but it's a con game. I'm from Missouri. 4 Flushing, gold brick merchants, believe me, some bull. I took it like playing 3 days in Bumville. Them boobs got my goat for fare. Babe, no pipe. You were interdicted in consequence of some scandal. I ran a sporting house on the side, and I guess they endorsed my license for speeding. Your bishop took umbrage at some business activity which he judged incompatible with your vows, like Kelly did. Oh, Bishop Kelly, far too severe a disciplinarian, in my judgment. But you are still a priest. Your orders are still valid. A baptism or a marriage performed by you would hold good. It's cinch. The Hallelujah Guarantee and Trust Company, St. Paul offices in the James D. Athanasius building. Then, sir, I shall ask of you the favor to hold yourself in readiness to baptize 2 persons at 9 of the evening precisely, the day after tomorrow. That ceremony will be followed by another in which you will marry them. I spun. I may rely on your good offices. I'll come in a wheelbarrow. Suit yourself, Mr. Butcher, as to the mode of transit, but pray be careful to attend punctually and in canonical costume. I'll dig the beretta out of the icebox. For a further exchange of courtesies, the new discipline took his leave. The same evening witnessed a very different interview. Lord Antony Bowling was being entertained at dinner by Simon If, and the conversation turned upon the favorite subject of the old mystic, the way of the Tao. In view of what you have been saying about the necessity of dealing with mediums on their own ground, remarked the host, let me tell you of a paradox of magic. Do you remember a certain chapter in the Bible which tells one almost in consecutive verses, firstly to answer a fool according to his folly, and secondly, not to answer him? This is the scriptural version of a truth which we phrase otherwise. There are two ways of dealing with an opponent, one by beating him on his own ground, the other by withdrawing to a higher plane. You can fight fire with fire, or you can fight fire with water. It is, roughly speaking, legitimate magic to resolve a difficult situation. Either of these two ways, alter it or withdraw to a higher ground. The black magician, or as I prefer to call him, sorcerer, for the word magic should not be profaned, invariably withdraws to lower planes. Let us seek an analogy in the perfectly concrete case of the bank cashier. Now, I prefer Aleister Crowley's other definition of the black magician as somebody who, well, lower plane, that's another way of phrasing it, though. Somebody who's doing a work that is basically not the devotional, not the developmentary sort of way. It's not their true will. But generally it's thought there's stuff, well, it is your true will if you're doing stuff that's dealing with what is interfering with your progress. And also the whole black magic and curses and all that sort of thing. There's that way of defining it. This gentleman, we may assume, finds the salary inadequate to his outgoings. Now he may economize, that is, withdraw himself to a kind of life where money is no longer needed in such quantity, or he may devote himself day and night to his business, and so increase his salary, but there is no third course open to a man of self-respect. The sorcerer type of man appeals to lower planes of money-making. He begins by gambling. Beaten there, he resorts to the still viler means of embezzlement. Perhaps finally he attempts to cover his thefts by murdering his mother for the insurance money. Notice how his planes become debased. His fears grow greater. At first, he is merely annoyed about his creditors. And the next stage, he fears being sharpened by his fellow gamblers. Then it is the police who loom terrible in his mind. And lastly, the grim force of the executioner threatens him. Very nicely, Hogarth said, Lord Antony, reminds me of how the habit of lying degenerates into intelligible stupidity. We hired a case in the War Office last month, a matter of supplying certain furs. As you know, the seal furnishes a valuable fur, less valuable, though superficially similar, is that of the rabbit. Now in trade, so it appears, it is impolitic to say rabbit, which sounds cheap and nasty. So the scriptural equivalent, coney, is employed, thus combining piety with profit. Having caught your coney, you proceed to cook him until he resembles seal. So you have a dyed rabbit skin, and you call it seal coney. But there are byways that stray further yet from the narrow lane of truth. The increased demand for rabbits has reduced the profit on seal coney, and it becomes desirable to find a cheaper substitute. Reckless of the susceptibilities of the ancient Egyptians, this is found that in that domesticated representative of the lion family, which consoles our spinsters, having disguised the skin as far as may be, they next disguise the name. Some buyer must be made to pay the price of seal coning and think that he is getting it. So cat becomes trade seal coning. And unless one has the whole story, there is no possibility of derivation. The lie has become mere misnomer. It is the general case of Anglo-Saxon hypocrisy, returned Simon If. I had an amusing example the other day in an article I wrote for the review. Rather prudish people my little essay ended. So science offers her virgin head to the caress of magic. The editor thought virgin rather a suggestive word and replaced it by maiden. You reminded me of a curate we had over a Gribthorpe Ambrose. Leg has for many years been not a quite proper word. When the terrible necessity of referring to it arose, the polite ass replaced it by limb. The refined sensibility of our curate perceived the indelicacy of saying limb, since everyone knew that it meant leg, so he wrapped it up in the decent obscurity of the Latin language and declined to play croquet one afternoon on the ground that the day before, on visiting Miss Postlethwaite, he had severely strained his member. Okay. The wicked fall into the pit that they have digged, said If. All this applies to the question of magic. It is a question of debasing coinage. I have great sympathy with the ascetics of India and their monkish imitators in Europe. They held special gifts to be of supreme value and devoted their lower powers to the development of the higher. Of course, mistakes were made. The principles carried too far. They were silly enough to injure their lower powers by undue fasting, flagellation, and even mutilation. They got the false idea that the body was an enemy, whereas it is a servant, the only servant available. But the idea was right. They wanted to exchange dross for gold. Now the sorcerer offers his gold for dross, tries to exchange his highest powers for money, or the gratification of envy or revenge. The Christian scientist, absurdly so-called, is a sorcerer of the basest type, for he devotes the whole wealth of religion to securing of his bodily health. It is somewhat stupid, too, as his main claim is that the body is only an illusion. Am I right in suggesting that ordinary life is a mean between these extremes, that the noble man devotes his material wealth to lofty ends, that advancement of science or art or some such true ideal, and that the base man does the opposite by concentrating all his abilities on the amassing of wealth? Exactly. That is the real distinction between the artist and the bourgeois, or, if you prefer it, between the gentleman and the cod. Money and the things money can buy have no value, for there's no question of creation, but only of exchange. Houses, lands, gold, jewels, and even existing works of art may be tossed about from one hand to another. They are so constantly, but neither you nor I can write a sonnet. And what we have, our appreciation of art we did not buy. We inherited the germ of it, and we developed it by the sweetness of our brows. The possession of money helped us, but only by giving us time and opportunity and the means of travel. Anyhow, the principle is clear. One must sacrifice the lower to the higher, and as the Greeks did with their oxen, one must fatten and bedeck the lower so that it may be the worthier offering. And what happens when you go on the other track? When you trade your gold for pewter, you impoverish yourself. The sorcerer sells his soul for money, spends his money, and finds he has nothing else to sell. Have you noticed that Christian scientists are hardly ever in robust health? They have given up their spiritual forces for a quite imaginary standard of well-being, and those forces which were supporting the body quite well enough without their stupid interference are debilitated and furthered away. I pray daily for a great war that may root out the coward fear of death and poverty in the minds of these degenerate wretches. That should be as it used to be in the Middle Ages, even and yet more in pagan times, the fit reward of a climax of a life well spent in risking it for noble causes. And poverty should be a holy and blessed state, worthy of the highest minds and the happiest, and of them alone. To return to our sheep, our sorcerer, he has not much against him to begin with, but he chooses to trade his sword for gold. The barbarian, having the sword, naturally uses it to recover the gold. In other words, the devil, having bought the soul, regains the price, for the sorcerer spends it in the devil's service. The next stage is that the sorcerer resorts to crime, declares war on all humanity. He uses vulgar means to attach his ends, and the price may be his liberty. Ultimately, he may lose life itself in some last desperate effort to retrieve it all at a blow. When I was young and had less experience, I had many a fight with sorcerers, and it was always the end of the fight when Mr. Sorcerer broke the law. He was no longer fighting me, but the consolidated will of humanity, and he had no time to attack me when he was busy building breakwaters. And that reminds me, we have a young friend at bay with the worst pack of devils in the world. I wonder if I have done wrong to leave him so much to himself, but I wanted the boy to gain all the laurels. He's young enough to like them. I think I know who you mean, said Lord Antony, smiling, and I don't think you need be very much afraid. I never saw anyone much better fitted to take care of himself. For all that, he's in urgent danger at this very moment. He has incurred the greatest possible risk. He's gained a victory, but it has been only a clash of outposts. The enemy is coming up now, horse, foot, and artillery, with lust of revenge and desperate fear to inflame the original hatred. And unfortunately, the boy made some fundamental errors in his plan of campaign. Ah, well, Napoleon did that. Jena was the result of his own blundering miscalculations. So, to a certain extent, was Austerlitz. Don't fret. They're bigger. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. And my father's pet Hiccolist used to say, and now I must run away. There's a seance with a lady who materializes demon slugs. Don't forget to inscribe my name among the martyrs. And chapter 18 will be The Dark Side of the Moon. And I don't know if you can actually relate the Pink Floyd album to that at all, but